and confronting the corruption of life under Roman Empire. Jesus has been assembling a following that's growing, a following that just a chapter in front of this wanted to make him a king, a treasonous, seditious act. He had done this through public acts of civil disobedience and through direct confrontation with authorities and through a radical inclusivity of welcome towards the outcast and the last and the least and the lost. We would do well to think of Jesus as a Martin Luther King type or a Gandhi type, and think of all of the controversy that such leaders generate. It is only later, after their death, that we give them holidays and proclaim them heroes. In the time in which they are living, we fear them. They unnerve us. They're threats. And Jesus was no different. Right before this mountaintop story, Jesus confronts the powers of religion and politics. That's what we would call it. He confronted the powers of Israel. And what he said from that confrontation, what he said to his disciples is, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Beware of what they grow and develop. Right after this encounter with the powers that be, Jesus begins to talk about going to Jerusalem and suffering and death. He begins to name the inevitability of a crisis that is unfolding, that he sees. I'm not sure his disciples saw it. A crisis that won't end well for him, but will lead into an even greater mystery still to come. It was this talk of impending crisis, of doom and mystery, that led Jesus to take his three closest friends up the mountain. And I think of that as a spiritual retreat, a withdrawal, which Jesus does from time to time in the Gospels. A time of reflection, of self-examination, of discernment. And it's there on the mountain, an amazing, breathtaking, transcendent event takes place. Jesus is transfigured, which means that the disciples see him in an entirely new light, an entirely new perspective. Something happened on that mountain that altered their understanding of who this Jesus was. Something powerful happens on that mountain, something beyond reason, something mystical, otherworldly, something beyond mere words of explanation. I know a woman who was on a spiritual retreat several years ago. She had gone on that retreat knowing that there was in her life this distance between herself and God. There was a barrier that didn't allow her to trust God, to trust that life itself was good, and that goodness outweighs the struggle of life. She was, you could say, downcast and brokenhearted. And her spiritual life was like living with a concussion, an ongoing concussion. There was a dullness to it, a going through the motions, a routine, a hope, even when there was no hope. And she had been this way for many years, having simply been devastated by watching her mom's battle and eventual death from cancer. She couldn't live fully in the world and trust life fully in the world with so much tragedy and uncertainty all around her. While at the retreat, she was sitting at a table with a group of fellow pilgrims when suddenly, uncharacteristically for her, she fell into a trance. And the others around the table knew that something was happening. They could see that she was just staring off into the distance, but her face was perfectly at peace. even a bit ecstatic and flushed and thrilled. And so they all sat quietly so that this woman could have her moment, whatever it was. Inside the trance, what the woman saw was a fluttering of angel wings all around her, graceful and soft, beautiful, beyond beauty. And it wasn't a voice, but it was an utterly comforting assurance from these angel wings all around her that was saying to her, your mom is okay. All will be well. All will be well. And the pilgrims around the table watched as a tear and a second tear and a third tear streamed down her face, which was glowing with a rapture. She was transfigured with the glory of God right in front of her table. And then it was over. And the woman snapped back into the reality of the table, a table full of fellow pilgrims who had witnessed that something had happened. And something had happened. Every authentic encounter with God changes us. It never leaves us the same. And from that day on, the woman began to be healed of that dull, aching hurt, that mistrust of life, that mistrust that life is good despite the sufferings, that life was good, healed of her dampened spirit. She lived knowing that there was something more, that there was a mystery beyond the circumstances of life, and that all will be well. All will be well. What the disciples saw on that mountain was Jesus radiating with glory, with ecstatic presence. And his face shone just like Moses' face shone when Moses came off the mountain with the commandments. Jesus' clothes began to take on this glowing whiteness, whiter than white, which is the color of the martyrs of the faith. Those same martyrs who sit under the throne of God and whose prayers become incense that God breathes in and out for eternity. That's the book of Revelation's picture of what's going on in the afterlife. Astonished, the disciples then see besides Jesus, Moses and Elijah. Moses, the personification of the wisdom and instruction and the Torah of God, and Elijah, the zealous personification of the faithful obedience of all the prophets who would speak and embody the word of God. In other words, the disciples saw the law and the prophets, the embodiment of God's presence on earth as in heaven, completely surround Jesus in a transfiguring moment of rapture and ecstasy and glory. And who knows? Perhaps Moses and Elijah were reassuring Jesus, encouraging Jesus that despite the coming troubles, all will be well. All will be well. And then the clouds became thick all around them. It was probably mist and fog with no visibility, and a voice was heard, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." And the disciples, quite literally having their own mountaintop ecstatic experience, Peter shouting out, wanting to cement the moment by creating these shrines to honor the experience, to help them remember the experience, to help them relive the experience. But the voice brought them to their knees in overwhelming fear and terror, only to be touched by Jesus. Get up. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And the moment passed, and the experience ended, and the glory went away. But glory experienced has a way of shaping and altering one's life even after the powerful manifestation of its radiance passes. Jesus and his friends had gone up the mountain for a retreat from the demands and the heat of the growing movement. What's next was what was on everyone's mind, even as the crowds grew larger and the animosity and hostility of the scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees also grew. Jesus' roadmap, his plan was to march to Jerusalem, knowing that there would be a confrontation. The Son of Man must suffer. Jesus' demands for embodying the law and the prophets' instruction about justice. In an age where those demands that Jesus had outlined in the Beatitudes and throughout the Sermon on the Mount, in an age when those were being neglected by the religious and political powers of his time, a confrontation was inevitable. It's the same script in every age. Power seizes even more power, even as those who simply want to live just a family life become more and more burdened, oppressed, and squeezed until they cry out because they've got nowhere else to go. Jesus was acting and speaking and embodying a way of life that threatened the normality of the law and order of his culture. Something had to give. Fresh from the renewal of glory experienced, Jesus and his friends descend the mountaintop experience. They descend into the valley and they encounter a demon-possessed boy, which Jesus then heals. In other words, that moment of glory, of ecstasy, of rapture, of renewal cannot and did not last. As a matter of fact, they're not the point. Those moments are not the norm. We're not to build shrines, making them permanent. Rather, at best, those glory moments are aids that help us endure and make it through the valley of life. The demon-possessed boy, the troubled, the burdened, the afflicted, the last and the least and the lost, they're the norm. They're the norm. And most of us try everything possible to avoid them because, after all, each of us have troubles of our own. And we say if we are always giving, we'll be drained. And we're easily overwhelmed. If only we could experience a bit of glory, be renewed, take it with us on the road, take it with us in the valley, take it with us, as the blessing says, all the way, all the way, all the way down. But glory, God's glory, is not ours to command. Mystic experience, being transfigured, visions of angel wings, none of that can be conjured up by our religious rituals or manipulations. I think it's really important to remember the story of the mountaintop concludes in the valley. Mountaintop glory has to be taken all the way down to the point of individual need. The demon-possessed boy. Mountaintop glory isn't for itself. It's given for strength so that others might experience healing and hope. Jesus went up the mountain, but when he came down, he healed the one who could not be healed by others. This Wednesday, we will enter the glory of the season of Lent, a 40-day reenactment of Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, where Jesus wrestles with Satan, the deceiver, wrestles with deceit. It's a 40-day meditation where we try to adjust our own souls from our everyday responsibilities and focus on our everyday purpose. If you own a house, how is your house a sanctuary of peace for your neighbors? If you have a job, how does your employment benefit the purposes of God that Jesus has been teaching throughout the Sermon on the Mount? If you're married with children, how does your family continually welcome and include those whom others exclude? If you're retired, how does your time become a Sabbath for those who are being swept up and overwhelmed by the frenzy of life? These questions of self-exploration, of self-examination, are at the heart of Lent and can most certainly lead to a transfiguration within your own attitudes and priorities and way of life. Lent is a 40-day tune-up when you probe the valley of your life and then go down even deeper into your soul's cauldron. It can be a time of discovery. And that's what the church is actually about, a time of discovery. Each Sunday is a retreat from normal life. What we're doing right now is a retreat from our everyday responsibilities, so that we might be touched by something extraordinary that we cannot manipulate or conjure up, but we hope it could happen. Each Sunday is a communion with reflected glory that begins on high but filters itself all the way down into our own lives of struggle and doubt and perplexity. Each Sunday is an empowerment that encourages us to lift up the cross of sorrows so that others might be sustained by unexpected joy. Each Sunday, we are invited into deeper mystery. Christ in you, the hope of glory. May it be so.